secrets never slip the lip.
Who gave you the right to wear my tux?
Checking his pulse to make sure he's not lying.
They were the faces you trusted, the voices you laughed with, the best friends who vanished from your life without warning. What happened to the friendships that raised us? And why does it feel like we left a piece of ourselves behind with them? Richie Cunningham and Fonzie were a television miracle, two best friends who should have never worked and yet somehow made everything work. Richie was the clean-cut boy next door, the one who always did the right thing. Fonzie was the rebel, the leather jacket-wearing dropout with a mysterious past and a magical ability to fix anything, from jukeboxes to broken hearts. You looked at them and thought, no way. But you watched them and thought, of course. Their friendship was never about appearances. Richie gave Fonzie a sense of belonging, a glimpse into a stable family life. Fonzie, in turn, gave Richie the courage to step out of his own shadow, to push against the grain just a little and to embrace life with a bit more spark. Together, they made Happy Days more than a sitcom. It became a ritual. Their scenes were comfort food for the soul, milkshakes, garage talks, and that unwavering loyalty that only true best friends ever understand. Do you remember what it felt like to believe that someone would always knock on your door, even if they used their fist to do it? Laverne and Shirley were not just roommates. They were warriors in blue-collar armor, fighting their way through life with soda pop, sarcasm, and secondhand shoes. They lived in a tiny apartment in Milwaukee, worked at a brewery, and turned every disappointment into a reason to dance. Laverne had grit. Shirley had dreams. And when life pulled one of them down, the other one pulled harder to lift her back up. What makes it hurt now is realizing that kind of raw, messy, loyal friendship is something we do not see much anymore. Laverne and Shirley let us believe that life could be falling apart and still be worth laughing through. That having no money, no man, and no plan was survivable if you had a best friend in your corner. They stitched their lives together with inside jokes and late-night chats, and in doing so, they showed us how to survive too. So why did we let them slip away from our memories? Why did we stop honoring the kind of friendship that picks you up off the bathroom floor and hands you a soda? Maybe it is time we remembered. Not just Laverne and Shirley, but the feeling of being known and loved anyway. Mary and Rhoda never shouted their friendship from the rooftops. It was not loud or flashy. It was something quieter, more sacred. They were two women living alone in a big city in a time when that was still considered brave. Mary was poised, hopeful, and relentlessly kind. Rhoda was cynical, funny, and fiercely protective. They were different, but they were necessary to each other's survival. In the 70s, there were not many examples of real female friendship on television. But Mary and Rhoda changed that. Their bond was not built on gossip or competition. It was built on listening, on showing up, on being there in the middle of heartbreak, career failure, and moments of paralyzing self-doubt. They talked about the things women had been taught to hide: loneliness, insecurity, ambition. And they held space for each other without judgment. Rewatching their scenes today feels like opening a letter from your past self. You remember what it felt like to be uncertain, to be scared, and to have someone who believed in you anyway. Mary and Rhoda were the best friends who made you believe that being single was not a failure, that working hard was not silly, and that vulnerability was not weakness. So why did we forget them? Maybe because their love was not dramatic enough for reruns, or maybe because it reminded us too much of what we lost. The quiet phone calls, the tears on borrowed shoulders, the best friend who always knew when to bring wine. Mary and Rhoda were not just characters. They were the proof that even in solitude, you were never truly alone. Fred Sanford and Grady Wilson were two tired old men who made us laugh until we cried. Fred, the junkyard philosopher with a grumble in his throat and a soft heart hidden beneath his insults. Grady, his slower, gentler friend who never seemed to know quite what was going on but always showed up anyway. Together, they made the gritty edges of life in South Los Angeles look a little less sharp. There was nothing glamorous about their world, just piles of junk, bills they could not pay, and memories of better days. But Fred and Grady found joy in the rubble. They made jokes about death, taxes, and cornbread, and somehow made it all feel like a celebration. Their friendship was old school, rooted in decades of shared struggle, laughter, and pride. You could feel the weight of their history in every scene. Today, their names might not trend. Their faces might not show up on nostalgic listicles. But back then, they were everything. They gave voice to an experience so rarely seen on screen. Black men aging, surviving, and still finding ways to laugh. Grady never judged Fred's bark because he knew the man's heart. And Fred never pushed Grady away, no matter how many times he said something ridiculous. That kind of friendship, the unpolished, unfiltered, unwavering kind, feels nearly extinct now. Maybe we got too busy. Maybe we just stopped calling. But Fred and Grady are still there, waiting in the reruns, ready to remind us that loyalty does not have to look perfect to be profound. Mork and Mindy were the oddest couple to ever warm our hearts. Mork, the alien in rainbow suspenders who talked to his thumb. Mindy, the grounded young woman who found herself playing host to someone who did not understand gravity or basic human emotions. They were not supposed to become friends, but somehow they created one of the most unexpectedly touching friendships of the decade. Mork brought chaos, he brought confusion, but he also brought wonder. In a world where everyone was pretending to have it all figured out, Mork asked questions like a child, earnest, wide-eyed, and fearless. Mindy never made him feel small for not knowing. She taught him, with patience, with kindness, and with a steady heart that anchored the whole show. It is strange, looking back, how revolutionary their friendship really was. An alien and a human, a man and a woman, two people with absolutely nothing in common, and yet everything that mattered. Mork learned what it meant to care, to laugh, to cry. Mindy learned what it meant to let someone in, even when they came from another world. We forget them now, caught up in grittier stories and faster jokes. But Mork and Mindy were a love letter to empathy, to the weirdness in all of us. They reminded us that being different was not something to fix. It was something to celebrate. Maybe the reason we forgot them is the very reason we need them back. Because sometimes, what makes no sense is exactly what saves you. Oscar Madison and Felix Unger were chaos and control under one roof. One man lived in a cloud of cigar smoke and dirty laundry. The other was a tornado of neurotic routines and polished shoes. They were not just opposites. They were living proof that two people can drive each other insane and still never want to live apart. Oscar was a sports writer who saw no problem with letting pizza boxes grow roots in the living room. Felix vacuumed under the couch cushions every morning, but somewhere between the shouting and slammed doors, there was something unshakable. They fought like old married couples, and maybe that was the point. The Odd Couple was never really about clean versus messy. It was about what it means to build a life with someone you did not choose and end up needing them more than you ever expected. In an era where most shows still clung to perfect nuclear families, Oscar and Felix showed us the beauty of a chosen one. The friendship that grows not in spite of your flaws, but because of them. Today, we idolize compatibility, chemistry, peace. But there was something real about the constant, ridiculous friction between these two. They showed us that connection does not require harmony. Sometimes it is built on arguments, on learning to live with what annoys you, on late-night truce beers over takeout you both secretly hated. They made dysfunction look comforting and loneliness feel optional. Greg and Peter Brady were not just brothers. They were the heartbeats of every blended family trying to figure itself out. In a house full of rules, chores, step-siblings, and teen hormones, Greg and Peter found in each other something simple and grounding. Not competition, not rivalry, just brotherhood. Greg was the cool, level-headed older sibling, the kind of boy who always had a plan and usually a girl on his arm. Peter was the middle kid trying to make his mark, often caught between the younger chaos and the older expectations. But somehow, their bond never cracked. What made them unforgettable was not some big emotional storyline, it was the small moments, the advice in shared bedrooms, the gentle teasing, the support that came without asking. For millions of viewers in the 1970s, they were the dream. Two brothers who did not tear each other apart but grew up side by side, figuring things out one backyard football game at a time. In a world where broken homes and silent dinners were quietly becoming more common, Greg and Peter gave us an image of connection that felt safe, relatable, aspirational. They fought sometimes, sure, but they always came back together. They reminded us that family was not just about blood, it was about being there for each other, no matter how messy, awkward, or painfully teenage things got. You could count on Greg to lead with calm and Peter to bring in a little chaos. Together, they created a rhythm that made the Brady Bunch more than just a sitcom. It made it a lifeline. And for those of us watching back then, it was a gentle lesson we did not even realize we were learning. That brothers could be best friends, even when everything else was changing. JJ and Michael Evans were brothers born into hardship, but raised in something deeper than money: love, humor, and grit. In the concrete corners of a Chicago housing project, they turned survival into something close to art. JJ was the loud one, the artist, the funny guy with the fast comebacks and wild charisma. Michael was his opposite, quiet, intelligent, and constantly questioning the world around him. But together, they held each other up in a system that did not care if they fell. Their home was small, the bills were big, and yet, what they shared as brothers felt bigger than the walls could contain. In the roughest moments, it was not lectures or punishments that kept them going. It was each other. JJ's jokes softened the blows. Michael's sharp mind challenged the unfairness of it all. Good times did not sugarcoat the world, but it gave us two brothers who refused to let it break them. Their friendship was layered with complexity. There were arguments, sure, but there was also unspoken trust. They were different in every way, but united in purpose to take care of their family and never let the world define them. Watching them was not just entertainment, it was education. It was hope. They showed us that even when everything else was stacked against you, love could be your weapon, and humor could be your shield. Looking back, what hits hardest is how many people needed that reminder. That friendship is not about ease, it is about endurance. And JJ and Michael endured side by side, laugh after laugh, lesson after lesson. They made struggle look survivable, and they made brotherhood feel like a revolution. Bo and Luke Duke were never meant to follow the rules. They were cousins by blood, brothers by choice, and outlaws by heart. Hazard County was their playground and their battleground. Behind the wheel of the General Lee, they ran from corrupt lawmen, outsmarted greedy politicians, and somehow always made it home in time for supper. But what held it all together was not the stunts. It was their bond. In a decade where male emotion was still bottled up and buried deep, Bo and Luke showed affection through action. A shoulder nudge, a smirk, a dare. They might not have said, "I love you," but you knew it. You felt it. They were two kids growing up too fast in a broken system, using their car and their courage to rewrite the rules. What we lose when we forget them is more than a theme song or a Confederate-flagged car. We lose the spirit of rebellion driven by loyalty. We lose the idea that justice sometimes means doing the right thing, not the legal thing. And we lose a friendship built on mud, sweat, danger, and the knowledge that someone always had your back, especially when the road ahead looked rough. Bo and Luke were not just cousins, they were our reckless hope. And in every sharp turn, they reminded us, you do not have to run alone. Starsky and Hutch were more than partners. They were a lifeline in a city on fire. One wore denim, the other leather. One was hot-headed, the other thoughtful. Together, they tackled crime with grit and wit, but the real story was always between the gunfire. It was in the glances exchanged after a near miss, the loyalty unspoken but undeniable. When Hutch bled, Starsky shook. When Starsky broke, Hutch carried him. Their friendship was forged in high-stakes nights and endless stakeouts. They chased down killers, exposed corruption, and lived with the weight of every life they could not save. But between the chaos, there were coffee shop talks, dumb jokes, and long drives with the windows down. In a decade where masculinity was all toughness and silence, Starsky and Hutch said something radical. Real men could care, could cry, could protect each other without shame. They were brothers without the blood. In a sea of shallow partnerships, theirs ran deep. They disagreed, they argued, but they never let go. When one fell, the other caught him. And for those of us watching, that meant everything, especially in a world that often felt too sharp, too cruel, too fast. Their bond was a map through the madness. Today, buddy cops are everywhere, but most are just noise. Starsky and Hutch were different. They made you believe that friendship could survive anything, even bullets, betrayal, and burnout. That no matter how dark the case, the night, or the city, someone was out there willing to run through fire just to get you home. And maybe that is what we forgot. Not just the show, but how good it felt to know someone would never let you fall alone. Paul Pfeiffer and Kevin Arnold were the kind of friends that only childhood can create, the kind forged in the awkward, emotional chaos of growing up. Kevin was our narrator, our window into the late 1960s and early 70s. But Paul? Paul was the anchor, the one constant. With his allergy list longer than most grocery receipts and his gentle, nerdy charm, Paul was the soft counterweight to Kevin's impulsive heart. They did not always get along, but they never let each other go. In the Wonder Years, their friendship was never polished. It was never perfect. It was exactly how real friendship feels when you are 12 years old. One part blind loyalty, one part mutual annoyance, and one big part shared wonder. They knew each other before they had words for what they were feeling. And when the world around them started getting complicated, politics, parents, heartbreak, they found comfort in the simple fact that someone else was walking the same road. Rewatching their scenes today is like cracking open your own childhood diary. It is all there. The confusion, the jealousy, the laughter that only made sense to the two of you. Paul never had all the answers, but he always picked up the phone. Kevin could be selfish, but he always came back. In an era that was losing its innocence, their friendship held on to something pure. And yet, somewhere along the way, we forgot them. Forgot how much those quiet, ordinary friendships shaped us. Maybe because they never had a big finale, just a slow, growing distance that felt too familiar. But Paul and Kevin remind us that the people who walked beside us in our youth, awkward, imperfect, loyal, left footprints that never really fade. George Jefferson and Tom Willis were the unlikeliest of friends in one of the most important shows of the decade. George was brash, loud, fiercely proud, and unfiltered in ways that made you laugh and wince at the same time. Tom was white, liberal, laid back, and married to a black woman, something George never let him forget. But here's the thing. Even when George teased, insulted, or stormed out, he always came back. Because somewhere under all that bravado, George respected Tom, maybe even loved him. Their friendship was a collision of race, class, pride, and identity. The Jeffersons never played it safe, and neither did these two men. They argued about everything from social issues to who made better coffee. But underneath the shouting and side-eyes was something solid, something honest. Tom never tried to change George, and George, for all his tough talk, never walked away. What made it matter was how human it felt. They were neighbors, fathers, husbands, men who wanted respect, even if they could not always give it. And somehow, through the noise, they found a kind of understanding that most people never even look for. They challenged each other, grew, pushed back against stereotypes, not by preaching, but by living alongside each other day after day. It is easy to forget that shows like this were once revolutionary. Easy to forget that a loudmouth businessman and his mild-mannered white friend once helped America laugh through some of its deepest divides, and that maybe, in some small way, they helped us see that difference is not the enemy of friendship, it is the test of it. Tom and George were not just comic relief. They were a blueprint, for dialogue, for tension, for change, and for what happens when you stay in the room long enough to hear each other. Archie Bunker and Barney Hefner were the kind of friends who never needed to explain why they hung around each other. They just did. Archie, the mouthy, set-in-his-ways working-class patriarch. Barney, his poker buddy and barstool companion, sometimes quiet, sometimes clueless, but always there. In a world where Archie raged and ranted about everything, Barney was his soft landing. A steady presence that made you realize Archie was not as alone as he liked to act. All in the Family was never a gentle show, and neither was Archie. He said the wrong things, believed the wrong things. But with Barney, he let his guard down, just enough for us to see the man beneath the bluster. Their friendship was not poetic, it was not emotional, but it was dependable. A shared beer, a shared laugh, a silence that said, "You're still my friend, even if you drive me crazy." Barney was the one who sat through Archie's nonsense, not because he agreed, but because he understood. Sometimes he even pushed back. Not with anger, but with a kind of quiet clarity that made you think maybe, just maybe, Archie was listening, or at least learning how to. Their scenes were a reminder that not all friendships are loud with love. Some are subtle, steady, formed over years of habit and history. We forget those friends, the ones we never thanked, but always expected to be there. And maybe we forget because they were so constant, they felt invisible. Barney Hefner may not have been flashy, but he mattered. Because he stood next to Archie when no one else could, or would. And in doing so, he showed us the small, invisible grace of just showing up, again and again. Hawkeye, Pierce, and Trapper. John McIntyre were two army surgeons knee-deep in blood, death, and war, but still found ways to laugh, drink, and remind each other that life was worth holding on to. MASH was not just a war show, it was a survival show. And Hawkeye and Trapper, they were its heartbeat, sarcastic, rebellious, borderline unhinged, but fiercely loyal to each other and to the people around them. They operated in tents with barely enough supplies, slept on cots, lived with the constant hum of helicopters bringing in fresh wounds. And yet, they found a way to keep their sanity intact, usually through bad jokes, late-night pranks, and enough gin to make the horrors blur. But under the humor was something far more sacred, a friendship built not on convenience, but on necessity. You needed someone to get through that kind of madness. For Hawkeye, that someone was Trapper. They were different men in many ways. Hawkeye was the showman, the bleeding heart who cracked wise to keep from breaking. Trapper was quieter, more grounded, but just as sharp. They made each other better. Or maybe they just helped each other not fall apart. Watching them now, knowing how real those war stories were, hits harder than it used to. These were not just television characters. They were echoes of the very real friendships forged in the worst conditions imaginable. And they showed us that even when the world collapses around you, laughter, shared, defiant, desperate laughter, can be a lifeline. Hawkeye and Trapper never got a fairy tale ending, but in the minutes they had on screen, they gave us something rare and lasting. The blueprint for how to survive the unthinkable. With humor, with heart, and with your best friend by your side. John Boy Walton and Jason Walton were not just brothers. They were soulmates born into the same dust-covered world. In the thick of the Great Depression, they grew up under one roof with more family members than bedrooms, more worries than wages. But through it all, their bond never wavered. John Boy was the writer, the dreamer, the voice of the family. Jason was the musician, the quiet soul who brought harmony when words were not enough. They were two sides of the same battered coin. The beauty of The Waltons was not in drama or spectacle. It was in the moments that passed like a front porch breeze. John Boy and Jason studying by candlelight, sharing secrets in whispers, working odd jobs to keep the house running. They never had much, but they had each other. And for anyone watching, that meant everything. Their friendship was built on silence as much as speech. Jason knew when to back off. John Boy knew when to lean in. They made space for each other's dreams. even when the world could not. That is not something you see much anymore. Unspoken loyalty, forged not in conflict, but in quiet understanding. Rewatching their story now, you realize how much we have drifted from that kind of closeness. Siblings today feel miles apart. But John Boy and Jason remind us of what it means to be raised in the same storm and still find music, still find stories, still find love. They were not just television brothers. They were the kind of bond that reminded us family is not about who gets the last word, but who listens first, and who stays long after the story ends. Chico Rodriguez and Ed Brown were an impossible pair, and that is exactly why they worked. Chico was young, optimistic, full of jokes and dreams. Ed was old, bitter, and more comfortable talking to his car than to another human being. But when Chico showed up at Ed's broken-down garage and refused to leave, something changed. Not all at once, not with speeches or hugs, but in the quiet moments, in the shared laughter, in the silent acceptance that maybe, just maybe, they needed each other. Chico and the Man was one of the first shows to truly acknowledge the cultural gap between generations, between races, between lives lived on opposite sides of the street. Ed was a white man from another era, gruff, guarded, and prejudiced. Chico was a young Chicano trying to build something better, trying to connect. And somehow, he did. Not by yelling, not by preaching, but by being there, every day, every morning, with patience, with persistence, with heart. Their friendship was not tidy, it was not easy, but it was real. Ed resisted. Chico stayed. And in doing so, they gave television one of its most quietly groundbreaking relationships. It was not about grand gestures. It was about a cup of coffee shared in silence. A smile reluctantly returned. A garage that felt less lonely. There was something beautiful in that transformation, and something tragic in how easily we let it fade from memory. They did not fix the world, but for a few seasons, they proved it could change. Ponch and John were not just partners on motorcycles, they were a balance of spirit and steadiness in a world that moved way too fast. Officer Frank Ponch Poncherello was the charmer, the rule bender, the guy who smiled at danger like it was an old friend. John Baker, on the other hand, was all discipline, clean-cut, thoughtful, and the steady hand that kept the bike on the road when Ponch pushed it too far. Together they patrolled California's freeways with sunglasses, swagger, and something deeper, real trust. Chips was more than flashing lights and high-speed chases. It was about two men who had each other's backs long before it became a tired TV trope. When things went sideways, John never had to ask where Ponch was, and Ponch never doubted John would catch him if he fell. They joked, they argued, but the foundation never cracked. Their loyalty was unwavering, even when the job pushed them to their limits. You felt safe watching them, maybe because they felt safe with each other. There was never a question of betrayal, never a need for speeches. Just nods, handshakes, shoulder pats that said, "I got you." And they meant it. In a decade full of shows about lone heroes, Chips gave us something better, a duo who leaned into each other's strengths and covered for each other's flaws. They made heroism look human, made uniforms feel personal. Now, decades later, we forget how important that kind of dynamic was. How rare it is to see two men work side by side with mutual respect instead of silent competition. Ponch and John were not perfect, but they made us believe that even on the wildest roads, someone would ride beside you and never let you crash alone. Quincy and Sam Fujyama were not your typical crime-solving pair. They did not carry guns, they carried scalpels. Their battleground was the morgue, not the streets. Quincy, the relentless medical examiner, was all passion and impulse. Sam, his assistant, was calm, methodical, and quietly brilliant. Together, they cracked open bodies to solve mysteries, but the heart of the show was in how they handled each other. Quincy had a temper. He challenged everyone, cops, politicians, even his own bosses. But Sam? Sam never flinched. He was the anchor in the storm, the one who translated Quincy's chaos into something coherent. He knew when to step in, when to stay silent, and when to push back. and in return, Quincy trusted him more than anyone else. Their friendship never needed big speeches. It played out in lab coats, over slides and samples, in looks exchanged across examination tables. They respected each other deeply, even when they disagreed. That respect was rare on television, especially between a white lead and an Asian American supporting character in the 1970s. But there it was, quiet, consistent, unshakable. We forget them now, lost in a sea of flashier crime shows. But their dynamic deserves remembering, because it showed us that friendship does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like showing up day after day, dissecting tragedy together, and still finding reasons to believe in justice, in truth, and in each other. Frank and Joe Hardy were not just teen detectives. They were brothers in every sense that mattered. Sleuthing partners, protectors, each other's shadow. Together, they turned dark corners and cracked open cases that grown men could not solve. But behind every magnifying glass and flashlight was a bond that made all the difference. Frank, the older one, was methodical and cautious. Joe, younger and bolder, acted on instinct. Their dynamic was textbook balance. One thought things through, the other made things happen. They did not always agree, but they always moved as a unit. You never saw one without the other. They had secrets between them, looks only they understood, and a rhythm built from years of sharing rooms, dreams, and danger. We watched them and wished our own siblings could be like that. Allies, teammates, people you could count on, even when the world turned sideways. And maybe that is why they stuck in our hearts long after we stopped watching. They gave us a fantasy that felt possible, that someone could always have your back, not out of obligation, but out of love. Frank and Joe Hardy were not just characters. They were a promise that even in the loneliest chapters of growing up, there could be one person who understood you better than anyone else and never let you walk into the dark alone. George and Louise Jefferson were married, yes, but they were also best friends in a way that most couples on television never got to be. George was loud, stubborn, and unrelenting in his climb to the top. Louise, or Wheezy, was his grounding force, graceful, wise, and endlessly patient. They clashed, they bickered, but at the core of every argument was something deeper than love: trust. In a time when most sitcom marriages felt hollow or idealized, George and Louise were real. They had history, laughter, struggles, and they showed us that partnership was not about perfection, it was about presence. Louise did not just support George, she challenged him. And George, for all his arrogance, always came back to her. Because he knew, without Louise, none of it meant anything. Their friendship was built over decades, through poverty, through prejudice, through the long, hard fight for something better. They celebrated wins together, grieved losses together, held each other up when the world tried to knock them down. It was a marriage, yes, but it was also the kind of friendship that becomes a lifeline when nothing else feels certain. They moved on up, but they never left each other behind, and that is what made them unforgettable. Some shows lasted long enough to become legends. Salute Your Shorts only needed one season. Set in Camp Anawanna, this scrappy little series captured the chaos, laughter, and bittersweet awkwardness of summer camp better than anything before or since. It was loud, it was messy, it was perfect. Every episode was a snapshot of friendship forged in bug spray and bad cafeteria food. You had Donkey Lips, the lovable underdog; Budnick, the rule-breaking prankster with a hidden soft side; Z, Dina, Sponge. They were not polished or pretty. They were real. Kids who wore mismatched socks, fought over bunk beds, and stayed up too late daring each other to sneak into the woods. But what made Salute Your Shorts stick was its honesty. It understood that camp is more than canoe races and ghost stories. It is where kids first learn how to be away from home, how to find your place, how to fall in and out of crushes and feel like the world is ending over a lost flashlight. It was funny, yes, but also deeply nostalgic. Even as it aired, it felt like something already gone. Maybe that is why it ended so quickly. It burned too bright. Networks wanted polish. What they got was heart. Now it survives in memory, in campfire smoke and the sound of a distant whistle, in the way the theme song still gets stuck in your head out of nowhere. For those who remember, Salute Your Shorts was more than just a show. It was a summer that never really ended. Quinn Cummings was never the kind of child star who felt like a product. She was sharp, sincere, self-aware in a way that made her Oscar-nominated performance in The Goodbye Girl feel like more than just acting. It felt like truth. She was the clever kid who said what the adults were too afraid to, but even at her brightest, Quinn was already seeing through the glitter. She left acting before the industry could wear her down, before the roles dried up, before she became someone she did not recognize. Instead, she did something rare. She left on her own terms. Quinn became a writer, an entrepreneur, a commentator. Her essays cut like glass, funny, brutally honest, always thoughtful. She spoke openly about the absurdities of fame, parenting, and growing up in a world obsessed with image. Her exit was not a mystery. It was a declaration that her identity was not tied to box office numbers or red carpets, that she could be more. And she was. She built a second career from intellect and integrity, not nostalgia. In a culture that often devours its young, Quinn Cummings walked away with her voice intact. And maybe that is the most powerful kind of disappearance, the one that becomes a transformation. She is not gone. She is just somewhere better, somewhere real. Laurie Forman was the big sister you loved to hate on that 70s show. Sarcastic, manipulative, and endlessly flirty, she was the queen bee of basement drama. Laurie added chaos to the Forman household in all the best ways, but after season 3, she simply disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. When she did return in season 5, she was played by a different actress, and just as quickly, she vanished again. The show moved on, like Laurie had never left her mark on Point Place. No one even blinked. She was not just a punchline, she was an emotional bomb waiting to go off in every room she entered. Her presence made Eric weaker, Kitty more nervous, and Red quietly furious. She was the part of the family that was never stable, and that was what made her essential. Without her, the Formans felt safer, but a little less real. In real life, her original actress was reportedly dealing with personal struggles, and the show recast her to keep the storyline moving. But the final vanishing left a strange echo, one that felt unfinished. Laurie was a complicated character, but she was also real. She represented rebellion, bad decisions, and the uncomfortable truths about growing up. To see her erased without comment, without conclusion, left a void that was never quite filled. How do you close the door on someone who made the house feel alive? Some shows are just too weird and wonderful to survive. The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. was one of them. Imagine a show that mixed cowboy shootouts with futuristic science fiction, where a Harvard-educated bounty hunter rode horseback through the Wild West chasing outlaws and ancient alien technology. It should not have worked, but somehow it did. Bruce Campbell's Brisco was charming, sharp, and oddly philosophical for a man in spurs. The tone was part Western, part comic book, and part pulp serial, and all heart. It winked at the camera, but never lost its soul. There were glowing orbs, steampunk gadgets, and a subplot about time-traveling artifacts that felt wildly out of place, and yet completely right. It was not just about justice. It was about belief. Belief in progress, in legacy, in the idea that even the Wild West had a future worth dreaming of. But television did not know what to do with it. The ratings were decent, the fan base was devoted, but it was too different, too out there. After one season, it was gone. One of the most original shows of the 1990s disappeared into the void while the world chose safer stories. Now, it lives on in whispers, on fan forums, in dusty DVD collections, in the memories of those who knew television had stumbled upon something special and let it slip away. Brisco County was ahead of its time. Maybe that was the problem. Or maybe the real adventure was just getting to see it at all. Mike Vitar was the kind of kid who made every summer feel like it could last forever. As Benny the Jet Rodriguez in The Sandlot, he was a symbol of speed, freedom, and the unbreakable magic of childhood friendship. And in the Mighty Ducks sequels, he brought that same fire to the ice. He was not just playing characters, he was becoming memories, the kind that stuck with you long after the credits rolled. But somewhere between the bases and the blue lines, Mike disappeared. There was no farewell press tour, no dramatic scandal, just a quiet exit in the late 1990s, as if he had run the bases one last time and never looked back. While the world was still quoting his lines and wearing Sandlot t-shirts, Mike was stepping into a new uniform, one that would define the rest of his life. He became a firefighter, a real one, not a role, not a scene, a life-risking, people-saving, dawn-to-dusk kind of job. It is the kind of pivot that tells you something about who he truly was. Fame might have found him, but it never changed him. And while the industry kept calling, Mike had already answered a different kind of call. There is something poetic about that. A child star walking away not out of failure, but out of purpose. He did not want to be remembered. He wanted to matter. And maybe that is why his disappearance feels less like a loss and more like a story we were lucky to witness, even if only for a while. Because some heroes do not wear costumes on screen. Some wear helmets and carry hoses. Connie Conehead was the teenage daughter in Saturday Night Live's infamous Conehead sketches, a family of aliens with strange appetites and even stranger accents who tried to blend into American suburbia. Played by Lorraine Newman, Connie was deadpan, awkward, and eternally embarrassed by her bizarre parents, just like any Earth teenager would be. She was the lens through which we saw the Coneheads try to live a normal life, going to school, hanging out with humans, occasionally devouring six-pack cartons of beer. And then, somewhere in the late 1970s, Connie was gone. The sketches kept coming for a while. Beldar and Primat remained, but their daughter, their window into humanity, simply stopped appearing. Danny Lloyd gave one of the most iconic performances in horror history, before he even knew what horror was. As little Danny Torrance in The Shining, he whispered red rum into our nightmares and stared blankly into a future he could not escape. But off-camera, Danny Lloyd was not haunted. He was just a child with a quiet voice and a curious mind. And when the cameras stopped rolling, he did not chase the fame. He simply went home. He was only 6 years old when Stanley Kubrick cast him. Kubrick famously shielded him from the darker parts of the film, never letting him realize just how terrifying his role was. That protection became prophetic. Because after one more acting job, Danny Lloyd left Hollywood entirely. No talk shows, no press tours, no desperate clinging to a child role, just a vanishing act that felt almost supernatural. He became a biology professor, a husband, a father. He spent decades away from the limelight, content to live in a world where no one recognized his face, only his kindness. When he finally gave an interview years later, it was not to reclaim fame, but to reflect on how grateful he was for a normal life, one where he could grow up, finish school, and become someone beyond the boy who rode a tricycle through a haunted hotel. It is easy to forget that behind every iconic child role is a real child, and sometimes the best twist in a horror story is that the kid made it out, safe, happy, whole. Danny Lloyd disappeared, but not because he was lost, because he was found. There was no script, no set, no characters, just kids being kids. Bug Juice was one of the first reality series made for younger viewers, and it hit like a warm, unfiltered memory of summer that never fully leaves you. Set at real American summer camps, it followed groups of preteens and teens through weeks of friendship, homesickness, awkward crushes, personal growth, and emotional firsts. There were no plot twists, just real life, captured in all its messy honesty. You saw kids cry when they missed home. You saw them celebrate small victories. You saw them form bonds that felt bigger than the campgrounds they occupied. Bug Juice was not trying to entertain, it was trying to reflect. And in doing so, it did something more powerful. It made its audience feel less alone. It captured the exact moment when innocence starts to fracture, but wonder still holds on. There was beauty in the awkward silences, the shy glances, and the honest confessions of kids just beginning to understand themselves. For kids watching at home, these campers were mirrors. They were the same age. They had the same fears, the same jokes, the same hopes. The camera did not glamorize them, it simply followed them. That simplicity was its strength. It captured something so ephemeral, what it means to be on the edge of growing up, just for a moment. The show ended without ceremony, its cast scattered, its legacy quietly stored in the minds of a generation that still remembers how the campfire felt. In a media world obsessed with fiction, Bug Juice told a small, beautiful truth. Sometimes the most unforgettable stories are the real ones. Ben Geller was Ross Geller's son from his first marriage and Friends. He was there through the early seasons, sometimes adorable, sometimes awkward, but always a reminder of Ross's complicated life. But somewhere around season 8, Ben simply stopped showing up. He was not mentioned. He was not seen at family events. He was not even referenced during major milestones in Ross's life. It was like he disappeared into a television black hole. And unlike many vanishing characters, Ben's disappearance felt especially personal, because Friends was all about relationships, growth, and adulthood. How could Ross continue to date, move in with Rachel, and raise a new daughter while his first child simply ceased to exist? Behind the scenes, the producers shifted the show's focus away from parenting and more toward the core group's friendships. But that does not change the emotional cost. Ben was a symbol of a life that was not so easily erased. There was no scene of Ross explaining why Ben was not around, no call to say he was staying with his mother, no tension between Ben and baby Emma to justify the separation. The father-son bond, once so central, was replaced with complete silence. And with that silence, the show quietly asked us to pretend that fatherhood had an expiration date. It was as if a decade's worth of storytelling could be undone with one unspoken decision. What kind of narrative leaves out a child like a dropped punchline? For a show that defined a generation, this choice says more than any joke ever could. And yet, in the world of Friends, he vanished without a trace. What does it say about a show and maybe even a generation when a child becomes inconvenient to the plot? Jimmy McNichol was not just a teen idol. He was the teen idol of the late 1970s. He had the hair, the smile, the voice, and the kind of effortless charisma that made girls scream and casting directors scramble. He starred in films, television, and even had a short-lived music career with his sister Christy. But just when it seemed like he was destined to become a permanent fixture in pop culture, Jimmy did something nobody expected. He walked away. By the early 1990s, Jimmy had stepped back from acting completely. Not because the roles stopped coming, not because of scandal, but because he wanted something deeper than fame could offer. He turned to environmental advocacy and real estate, dedicating his life to causes that had nothing to do with cameras or red carpets. It was not a retreat, it was a rebirth. You have to understand what that means. To walk away at the height of popularity, to say no to the world's applause and yes to your own quiet purpose. Jimmy could have tried to stay in the spotlight forever. He could have milked his fame into middle age. Instead, he chose a life rooted in service, sustainability, and simplicity. Today, he lives peacefully, far from the noise of the industry that once adored him. He still speaks occasionally about his past, but never with bitterness, just gratitude. And maybe that is the lesson here, that some disappearances are not a fall. They are a return to solid ground. If you grew up in the 1990s, this show was like the cool older cousin who always knew what was up, but still made time to help you with your homework. Hangin' with Mr. Cooper followed Mark Cooper, a former professional basketball player turned high school teacher who used humor, honesty, and a whole lot of heart to guide kids through school and life. Played by Mark Curry, he was the kind of teacher everyone wished they had. He cracked jokes but never dodged the real stuff. He called it like he saw it. He cared. But the show was not just about Cooper. It was about a house filled with friends, family, and the messy love that holds them together. Vanessa, his confident and hilarious roommate, brought sass and style. Geneva and young Nicole added warmth and relatability. They all lived together, stumbled together, and picked each other up when the world got rough. It felt like family, even if it was not traditional. What made Mr. Cooper stand out was how seamlessly it blended life lessons with laughs. It dealt with serious issues, peer pressure, racism, disappointment, without ever getting preachy. And it never forgot to have fun along the way. For 5 solid years, it was a staple of the family night lineup. Then it was gone, quietly shuffled off the schedule, with little fanfare and less reason. The reruns dried up. The impact did not. Hangin' with Mr. Cooper was one of the last sitcoms that felt like it cared about kids and adults at the same time. And for many of us, that kind of care was rare. Jane Withers had a smile that could knock you sideways. In the 1930s, she was one of the most bankable child stars in Hollywood. Funny, spirited, and unmistakably bold. She lit up the screen in a way few kids ever could, and for a while, she seemed unstoppable. But by the time she was in her teens, she made a decision that shocked everyone. She retired. Jane stepped away from the spotlight while she was still beloved, while she could still call the shots, and for decades it seemed like she had vanished. But Jane never truly left the industry. She just shifted. She returned years later, not as a starlet, but as a character actor and voice performer. She reinvented herself quietly, steadily, and with an incredible sense of grace. Most of her later fans knew her not as the little firecracker from the 1930s, but as Josephine the plumber from television commercials in the 1960s. That is how versatile she was, able to charm audiences across generations without clinging to old glories. She was not trying to be a child star forever. She was just trying to be Jane. Her journey is not one of heartbreak, but evolution. Jane Withers reminds us that disappearing is not always a tragedy. Sometimes it is an act of wisdom, of timing, of knowing when to step back and when to reappear with something new to offer. Tara Maclay was the heart of Buffy the Vampire Slayer's 6th season, and arguably the emotional glue that held Willow together. Gentle, kind, and quietly powerful, Tara brought softness to a show built on supernatural violence. She was the kind of character who made the pain feel worth surviving. And then, in one brutal moment, she was gone. Killed by a stray bullet. No last words, no resolution. Her death came out of nowhere and was used purely to trigger another character's descent. What followed was even more disturbing. There was no funeral, no real mourning, no tribute to the woman who helped Buffy's family stay whole. She was not just Willow's partner, she was a beacon of quiet strength in a world full of chaos. Her absence left a void that even magic could not fill. She was not honored, remembered, or spoken about with the weight she deserved. Her death was treated as a plot device, not a tragedy. Behind the scenes, it was a plot device. But to fans, especially those who saw themselves in Tara, it felt like a betrayal. She deserved better. She deserved remembrance. Instead, her silence became part of the noise. How many gentle souls do we lose to someone else's storyline? There was something disarmingly genuine about brotherly love. Maybe it was because the 3 brothers on screen, Joey, Matthew, and Andrew Lawrence, were real brothers in real life. Or maybe it was because the show never tried too hard. It just let the relationships speak for themselves. Set in Philadelphia, the series followed Joe Roman, a motorcycle-riding older brother who returns home after their father's death to help raise his 2 younger half-brothers and manage the family business. It was not flashy. It was not trying to reinvent the sitcom. It was just about a broken family trying to make things work. And somehow, that made it feel like everything. Joe was rough around the edges but protective. Matt was the overachiever with a heart too big for his age. Andy was the comic relief and the emotional glue. Together, they rebuilt more than just a business. They rebuilt trust. They rebuilt a family. Brotherly love hit differently because it did not pretend everything was fine. It showed grief without drowning in it. laughter without ignoring the pain. And it gave kids and parents alike a rare glimpse into what it means to show up for people, even when it is messy, especially when it is messy. The show was short-lived, barely 2 seasons, but it carved out a quiet place in the hearts of anyone who ever lost something and had to figure out how to move forward, one day at a time. Not all love looks perfect. Sometimes it just looks like 3 brothers under one roof, doing the best they can. Chuck Cunningham was Richie's older brother in Happy Days, a tall, sporty figure who seemed destined to be part of the show's fabric. He played basketball. He gave Richie advice. He sat at the family dinner table. Then, like Judy Winslow, Chuck disappeared. Not just phased out, forgotten entirely. In later seasons, the Cunninghams were referred to as having only 2 children. Chuck's existence was retconned, like some kind of television ghost story. His disappearance gave birth to what would later be called the Chuck Cunningham syndrome, the phenomenon of characters vanishing from shows without any resolution. There was no missing poster on the fridge, no empty chair at the table that made the others pause. Even flashbacks seemed to sidestep his presence, as if the show's memory had been surgically wiped. For longtime viewers, it felt like a silent betrayal. He had been erased not just from the plot, but from the family's memory. It was not just that he disappeared. It was that his absence changed the family and no one acknowledged it. What does it say when a show's past becomes optional? Chuck was not just forgotten. He was erased from a show about nostalgia itself. Some say the actor left. Others say the show never quite knew what to do with him. But to viewers, especially younger ones, Chuck was a sibling who was never mourned, and that kind of forgetting leaves a deeper mark than we realize. How many other characters were written off so cleanly, we stopped believing they ever existed? Charles Herbert was not just a child actor, he was the child actor of the 1950s. With over 40 feature films and dozens of television appearances before the age of 16, he was a household name at a time when television was still earning its place in the American living room. Audiences adored him. Studios wanted more of him. And like so many before and after, Charles gave the world every bit of himself before he was old enough to realize what that meant. But the applause that lifted him up became the silence that swallowed him. As he grew older, the roles dried up. His voice changed, his face matured, and suddenly the golden boy of the silver screen was just another forgotten teenager. The transition from child star to adult actor is a narrow bridge few can cross, and Charles slipped through the cracks. The phone stopped ringing. The fan letters stopped coming. The boy who had once earned more than his own parents now found himself struggling to survive. He spoke, later in life, with haunting honesty about the pain of growing up in the spotlight, about being used, managed, and then left behind. He battled addiction, faced poverty, and for years, he vanished from the public eye. But unlike many who disappear in silence, Charles eventually came back, not to act, but to tell his story, to warn others. He never blamed the audience. He never lashed out at the industry. He simply revealed the truth, that childhood is not a commodity. And fame, especially when given to a child, is never a gift without cost. Charles Herbert did not just disappear. He faded, slowly, quietly, and with more grace than the world ever gave him. Few shows dared to be as gentle and raw as the Waltons. In a television landscape growing louder and flashier, this quiet drama about a rural Virginia family during the Great Depression and World War II was an act of rebellion. It reminded us that the world did not need to be big to feel important. Watching the Waltons felt like returning to a house you never lived in but still knew by heart. The opening narration was a hug. The goodnight scenes at the end of each episode were a lullaby. The series followed the tight-knit Walton family, 7 children, 2 parents, 2 grandparents, and turned their small victories and heartaches into epic truths. When John Boy chased his dream of becoming a writer, when Mary Ellen faced life after loss, when the family sat around a dinner table with barely enough food but more than enough love, it was more than a story. It was a reflection. Somehow, a show about a family from another era became the emotional backbone of real families watching together in the 70s. But time is cruel. As new decades arrived, the Waltons faded. The world moved faster, and it stopped looking back. Now it exists mostly in boxed DVD sets and the whispered memories of people who remember what real family television used to feel like. They do not make shows like this anymore, because maybe they think we no longer need them. But the truth is, we do. Maybe now more than ever. Kathy Sims arrived in the Office's 8th season like a quiet ripple before a potential storm. She was introduced as Pam's maternity leave replacement, but it was quickly made clear she had her eyes on more than just the receptionist desk. Kathy was flirty, subtle, calculated. She began targeting Jim Halpert, a fan favorite and the other half of one of television's most beloved couples. Tension built. There were long looks, a hotel room encounter that never went too far, but went just far enough to make fans squirm. She was not just a distraction, she was a test, a mirror held up to Jim's moral compass, one that shook the comfort of the show's romantic idealism. And then the test was thrown out, the mirror cracked, and no one wanted to look at the shards. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, Kathy was gone. No final scene, no resolution, no consequences. She simply stopped showing up. The writers never addressed it. Jim never mentioned her again. Pam never found out. It was as if the emotional bomb the show spent episodes building had been quietly diffused in the night. Behind the scenes, the backlash from fans may have influenced the decision to drop the storyline. But the silence left behind was louder than anything Kathy ever said. Her role was uncomfortable, and her presence disrupted the show's romantic backbone. But that's what made her interesting. By wiping her away without closure, The Office missed the chance to explore something deeper: temptation, guilt, emotional fidelity. Instead, we were left with a character who became little more than a threat the show was too afraid to finish. What does it say about love stories when we are only allowed to remember the parts that feel safe? Which of these friendships hit home for you? Drop it in the comments, tap like, and subscribe to keep the memories coming.